So let's jump right into the discussion of Objective-C and Swift by looking at variables and constants. Now, these are something that are very ubiquitous throughout all languages, of course, but we're going to find that even though these are basic items, that there are some pretty substantial differences between Objective-C and Swift, and these are differences that are going to carry forth throughout the language. So right away, we're going to get into some really very important topics here. So we're going to start here with a variable, and of course, the difference between a variable and a constant is that a variable can change once assigned. So when you assign something as a variable and later want to change the data that's within it, you can go ahead and do that. Whereas with a constant data type, once the data is assigned, you are no longer able to change it. So we're going to start with a very basic one, which is an integer data type, and we're going to create one in Objective-C. So to do that, we'll start with int, and we'll call that mynum, and we'll say it is equal to 5. So we've created a data type of type integer. We've called it mynum, and we've given it a value of 5 ended by a semicolon. So let's look at how you would do exactly the same thing with Swift. So in Swift, we're going to type, since this is, again, a variable, we're going to type var, which is short for variable, of course, and then we're going to type the name, mynum, followed by a colon, and then we're going to follow that by the type. So this is an int with a capitalized I, and we'll say equals 5. And so now we have really the same exact statement where we said we have a variable type, and we've given it a name of mynum, we've called it an integer type, and we've given it that value of 5. Now, you might be saying right off the bat, I thought that Swift was a much more concise language. I thought there was less to do in terms of typing out statements and so forth. And what we're seeing right away immediately is a statement here, a basic statement that is already longer to input in Swift than it is in Objective-C. But in fact, the way that we've defined it here is, again, what I would call the long form way. And there is a much simpler way of typing that same statement in. So what we'll do here is comment that out, and we're going to type a shorter way of doing it, which is to say, again, var mynum, but we'll set that directly equal to 5. So now what we've been able to do is no longer have to say int directly, and instead just create this variable, give it the name, and then immediately assign it its value. So let's talk about now the differences between these two, because there's some that may be a little superficial, but again, there's some behind-the-scenes importance here that you should really understand. So first, on the more superficial side, you'll notice with Objective-C, we use the semicolon, and that's a very common thing that you'll see throughout all C languages, that the semicolon is something that says the statement is ended. We finish the statement. Swift does completely away with the semicolon, as do other languages, like, for example, Python. So you will no longer be able to use, or should use, the semicolon in the Swift language, but you can actually use it if you want to. In addition, the semicolon can be used to tie or bridge statements together on the same line within Swift. But the fact is that the semicolon is really not a programming style. It is not something that should be added to your Swift code. As you get used to Swift and see more Swift code, you're not going to see the semicolon. So it may be there for legacy reasons, but it is something that you should get used to not including when you are writing your Swift statements. Now, the second thing to look at is this notion of int here, where we've said this is an integer, and we actually said that up here as well with Swift, but we didn't here. So we might ask ourselves, is Swift not type safe? In other words, can I assign this mynum a 5 and then later make mynum the letter G or something else? And the answer to that question is no. In fact, Swift is very type safe, but it makes use of something called type inference. And what type inference does is it will determine, based on the value that's been assigned to it, what that data type should be. So here it looks at this 5 and says, well, 5 is of course an integer. So now it says that, okay, mynum is of type integer, even though we didn't specifically tell it. And to prove that is the case, we're going to come down here and we're going to take mynum and we're going to make it equal to 5.5. So a double type or a float here. And immediately you see we have an error. And if we just tap on that, it says cannot assign value of type double to type int. So you can see that, again, even though we didn't specifically say that we have an integer data type here, it knew that we had an integer data type, and when we tried to change it to something that wasn't an integer, we get this error during the compile time. So if we were to then make this, let's say an integer here of 7, we can see it works with no error. So it is very type safe. It's just as type safe as Objective-C. It just doesn't demand that you define up front what the type is in code. You can, as we did up here in the top, but it is not necessary. So the other difference that is worth noting at this time is that this integer here with Objective-C and with the C languages is what's considered a primitive data type. So a primitive data type is a data type that really cannot be deconstructed any further. It is the basic type that's within the C languages, and other types would be float or double or bool. Those are basic primitive types within the C language. However, in Objective-C, in Swift, this would be considered a structure. So this is of a structure type. So that's very, very different. And we'll get into what it means to be a structure in later lectures. But for this point in time, it's important to know that even the type of data that this is, even the very basic thing that we consider or we think about when we're talking about integers as an example, even that is different between Objective-C and with Swift. So we've seen here in summary that we no longer need to use the semicolon when we're typing in Swift. We have with Swift something called type inference, so it can figure out what our data is without us specifically having to tell it what it is, as we do with Objective-C. And that even these basic variable types of integer are handled very differently, with them being primitives in Objective-C and, in fact, structures within Swift.